Hey everyone, welcome back to the Samir Show. Today I'm absolutely thrilled and honestly little mind blown to be sitting down with someone who just taken my brain the most incredible journey. We are talking to Mr. Richard Anderson, the author of The Evolution of Life, Big Bang to the Space Colonies. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I have to tell you that when I picked this book, I thought it's okay, it's a Big Bang Space Colonies. So that's a huge title, right? So, but you genuinely deliver the promises, whatever you have mentioned in this book. I like to grand story for everything. Really bow for you. I really admire. So let's dive into deep into that this book. And you don't start with the dinosaurs, you start with the big bangs. And for those who are just might picture the giant networks, can you just help to understand what is that big bang and what's the fundamental idea behind of everything was begun?
That's a big question. I think we have. I started there because, well, that's the root of our whole universe. That's everything that is today as a result of how the Big Bang happened. And physicists tell us that there are many ways the Big Bang or the beginning of the universe could have happened, which would not have led to life. It would not have led to the long-term stability of matter.
Mhm.
So the way the universe started is, of course, fundamental to our own existence. So I wanted to show how all this energy created at the Big Bang that then coalesced to create the beginnings of matter, and then the elements that we have on our chemistry table or
Mm.
periodic table, and then how those elements relate to one another in, uh, in the quantum arena, so on the very small subatomic world,
Mm.
to form molecules, and how these molecules then they can form in a certain number of ways, and there are some ways that are favored over other ways, and it led to organic molecules actually being formed before life.
Mm.
So we had amino acids, we had sugars, we had
Carbon, I think.
yeah, different precursors
Mm.
to the nucleic acids,
Mhm.
all floating around in space
Mm.
that were formed uh, by the Big Bang or shortly after, or by exploding stars, many ways. So those elements and those molecules are precursors of life, and they are a direct result of the Big Bang. So then once you have those, you need a fertile place for life to evolve. You need a
Right.
planet like Earth. So we go to that process, the beginning of life, the likely areas that life may have begun on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
So thermo chimneys at the bottom of the oceans, at the
Mm-hmm.
seams of the continental seams. In the early days of Earth, billions of years ago, those seams were frequent. The planet was, um, if you want to relate the seams and the areas to continents, they would be much smaller than they are today. And so there were many of active seams and many of these chimneys that burped up hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals at a very high temperature into a cold sea
Mm-hmm.
and formed precipitated minerals to form chimneys in which many scientists believe that that's where life began. In these protected chimneys, you had an energy source, you had a nutrient source with the minerals being pumped out of from the mantle of the earth. So once life began, evolution started. So pretty soon after.
Yeah, this is everything from the basically nothing that we can just imagine, right? That how did we get all this stuff that makes us like carbon, oxygen, that all that elements? Where did those come from in early universe?
Well, the carbon, oxygen are higher up on the chemical scale. In other words, they're more complex. Hydrogen is the simplest atom.
Hmm.
And as you go through the periodic table, the heavier ones, the heavier elements took more energy to form. And they were formed by fusion,
Hmm.
coming together of smaller molecules. So, for example, in our sun, it burns hydrogen to form helium. I
Okay.
say burns, it doesn't really burn like in the traditional sense,
Hmm.
but three hydrogen atoms collide together under high energy and form one helium atom. Now, there's more energy in three hydrogen atoms than one helium. So it releases a lot of energy in the process, and
Hmm.
that's called the fusion reaction. That kind of reaction can go up the chain. You can form carbon that way, you can form oxygen that way,
Hmm.
but it requires more energy the higher up the chain you get. So the Big Bang itself probably produced some of these higher elements because of the huge amount of energy. But later on, massive stars that collapsed on themselves
Hmm.
and exploded probably formed most of the oxygen, carbon, and higher nitrogen, higher elements that we see in life. Yeah, that's
So in your
so
book,
that's how the universe participated. I mean, set us up to have living beings on this planet.
yeah, so in your book that you have mentioned about the cosmic recycling, right?
Yeah.
What is it all about?
Well, I don't recall the exact context of that
Hmm.
phrase. Everything is, well, our lives are recycled. Okay, we go
Hmm.
back to our basic elements when we
Hmm.
die,
Okay.
dust to dust, was I guess
Yeah.
is a saying. But it's not a 100% recycle because there's something called entropy,
Hmm.
which is a tendency of the universe to go from order,
Hmm.
which can be translated as high energy, to disorder, which can be translated as lower energy.
Hmm.
So over time, the universe is losing energy, is gaining in entropy, and the ultimate fate is open for debate. We don't know exactly how it's going to end. There's been a number of recent changes in theories.
Hmm.
So some physicists believe the universe will expand forever and just kind of blink out
Okay.
eventually.
Okay. So after the Big Bang, that the galaxy is also created, right? So without the stars that we could be dying, we literally wouldn't be here. So that's a pretty profound thought. And then all of the cosmic dust, as you talk about, right?
Right,
So you highlighted on two things, as we let you know, that carbon and the liquid water,
right.
right? So what make those so special? Are they that is called the magic ingredients of the earth?
Yeah, they are magic. And, I personally, there have been a lot of suggestions that life could take another form, silicon-based, or could be use ammonia to, different ideas with different chemicals. I am a firm believer that, and I say believer because it's not scientifically proven, but there's a lot of evidence to support
Mm.
the idea that carbon is the only atom that can support a complex operation as life.
Mm.
Carbon is the only molecule. It can form millions and I mean atom. Carbon can form millions and millions of different molecules, different combinations. It's almost unlimited.
Okay.
Silicon can't.
Mm.
It's in the hundreds or maybe thousands, and silicon cannot form long chains. A long chain of silicon of a silicone would be it bridges with oxygen, so it'd be silicon, oxygen, silicon. It would form these long chains. So carbon, because of its unique atomic structure,
Mm.
um, can form unlimited compounds. So complex life, metabolism, even simple life,
Mm.
requires a vast array of different kinds of molecules formed by carbon and hydrogen, carbon and any number of other groups attached to it. And it functions in metabolism where silicon can't. The other thing is it forms compounds that can be soluble either in oil compounds, oil solvents,
Mhm.
or water soluble, or both.
Mm.
So, for example, our cell membranes, the cell membranes of bacteria, are made from what's called bipolar
Mm.
molecules of carbon. So one end of the molecule is soluble in oil, and the other end is soluble in water. and they line up to form a membrane, like a soap bubble type of membrane, and that keeps the molecules of the organism once it forms within an envelope, so they don't just float off into the environment. So those two. The other thing about water is it's bipolar.
Mm.
So carbon and hydrogen and form these long protein chains and ring structures, and they are soluble in water because water is charged. It's bipolar. One end of the molecule is negatively charged and the other end is positively charged. Its electrons tend to move from the hydrogen to the oxygen side, which gives
Okay.
it the negative on the oxygen side. So it's a bipolar molecule.
Mm.
It has many qualities other than just the metabolic or the interaction with protein. For example, in our lakes and oceans, on the surface of water, it forms a membrane, water tension, surface tension, it's called, because of the bipolar nature. So you have water molecules to the side of each other and to the bottom, but none above it. So the surface molecules are pulled down into the water to give you a membrane effect. So you have, spiders, water creatures that can
Yeah.
run across the top of the water. And the other thing it does is when it freezes, it forms a crystalline structure.
Mm.
So that is larger in volume than water itself. So it's because of that, it has a lighter mass. So when water freezes in the ocean, surface of the ocean, it doesn't sink to the bottom. It floats on the surface. If it sank to the bottom, you would have a gradual buildup of ice on the bottom of our oceans until they were all frozen over because the ice wouldn't float to the top so it could thaw in the changing seasons. So that's another property of water. So that's why when astronomers look at, they're looking for habitable planets
Hmm.
outside of the solar system. They're looking for water first,
Okay.
liquid.
Okay. So billions of years that, as you say, that like it's a kind of a bacteria that was the
Yeah.
first things that happened, right? After the before the billions of years. So that's incredible to think about that how long it took before anything complex start popping up. Like the first bacteria as you talk about, right? Do you think that does that particular bacteria has a brain or they are able to walk on that?
you know, they're learning more and more about what's called sentience or awareness,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of behavior in lower animals, lower plants, or plants and lower animals
Hmm.
um, that suggests that there's some response to their environment that is behavioral.
Hmm.
Um, and that's true with trees. That's true with the interaction of the tree roots with the mycorrhiza, the fungus that grows there. They
Hmm.
communicate chemically with one another. There's no intelligence involved, although you can get up to an ant colony or a bee colony, and you could say, well, there is a collective intelligence. There is a collective awareness with the hive. With
Hmm.
they operate almost as some of our brain cells do. They interact in a lot of the ways that our brain
Hmm.
uh, interacts. When they're looking for a new source of nectar or a new place to build a hive colony, they send scouts out, and the scouts come back and dance in front of the rest of them. And uh, how hard and how uh, insistent they are in their dances will sway the opinion of the colony as to say there's several sites that are being considered. They
Hmm.
send scouts out, the scouts come back and they say this. One group of scouts says this is a 10 plus site, and another group said, well, this is 8 plus. And they do their dance in accordance to how they feel about how good the site, the location is.
Hmm.
And then the group, the queen, and everybody decides, and they go to the. Well, our brain works a lot like that
Hmm.
in its thinking. It's a voting system. We get impulses, our neurons get impulses, and sometimes it takes a number of impulses before that neuron will fire to the next level. So if it gets three impulses, for example, it goes, oh, yeah, maybe there's something there, but it doesn't do anything. It gets eight impulses, and all of a sudden that's enough to kick it off to fire and send the message on up the chain. Now, I don't understand how it all works
Yeah, okay.
specifically,
Hmm.
but that's the concept. And so these lower forms, they do have a type of awareness. And I think that is a continuum all the way up to humans. So
Hmm.
we can look at any animal, any mammal, or any
Hmm.
higher form animal and realize that they aren't that different from us, dogs and cats
Right.
and
Right.
horses and so
Hmm.
forth. Uh, they have a pretty high awareness. My daughter recently got a cat, and the cat learned to open the back door to by
Wow.
watching by
Okay.
watching. It's a lever door, and the cat will jump up and grab the lever, and so they have to keep the door locked, or the cat will just open the door and go out.
Wow.
so so they're pretty intelligent.
Yeah.
Um, and the other thing is the ratio of the brain to the body size is more important than the size of the brain. For example, an elephant or a whale has a larger brain than we have, but they're
Hmm.
not more intelligent.
Correct.
Whereas a hummingbird has a tiny little brain,
Hmm.
but it's very, very intelligent because it's a very small body size. And so a lot of birds like parrots and macaws and crows
Hmm.
are known to be very intelligent.
Okay. So after the eon, just a tiny life something amazing happened, right? So suddenly or seemingly, we get all that complex creatures. So what you call that Cambrian explosion, right? So can you
Yeah,
explain what was that and how life really started to diversify to take all these crazy shapes?
that was a very important step. And when you have bacteria,
Mhm.
bacteria survive by sending enzymes, digestive enzymes, toxins, and digestive enzymes into the environment that they're living in, outside their own bodies, outside their own cells, I should say. Um, and those enzymes will digest food particles or other organisms, and then they can import or absorb the resultant proteins or amino acids that are a result of that digestion. That's how they survive. If they're omnivores, if they're photosynthetic or chemosynthetic, which means they make their own food by outside energy rather than by molecules or by sunlight, for example.
Hmm.
Then that's a different situation. But these organisms that the bacteria that eat other organisms secrete these toxic substances, so they don't make very good neighbors.
Hmm.
When they grow to a point where they're used up most of their food supply, they start to die off. Um, and so they could not form multicellular animals. They could not form multicellular organisms. They would have to be single cell because they reject each other. They eat each other.
Hmm.
And so an important evolutionary step had to happen. And what probably happened is a bacteria or um, a cardia. That's not quite the right word. Anyway,
Hmm.
um, one ingested the other.
Hmm.
They had a symbiotic relationship, which means a mutually beneficial relationship. So the bacteria that was engulfed was, I think, by a cyanobacteria, which is a different type of bacteria. Formed a energy organelle within the bacteria uh, the cyanobacteria.
Hmm.
That and then some other organelles were formed, and something called an endoplasmic reticulum. The bottom line is, it allowed all these um, metabolic processes to occur within the cell, so they didn't have to go out and send their enzymes to digest their neighbors. So they could live together a
Hmm.
lot easier. And they started to form aggregates because uh, that that they could differentiate their what the cell did. So one cell may have a lot of mitochondria, which you could consider to be a battery within the cell that provide it with energy. And another cell may have fewer and do different tasks, or may form structural
Hmm.
proteins, and a structural maybe a skeleton or integument on the outside to protect the organism as a whole. So multicellular organisms would not be possible without this elevation in cell type. So we call the first type, the bacteria, we call those prokaryotic.
Okay.
In other words, the nucleus, the nuclear material, is not enclosed in a membrane. It doesn't have any organelles or internal structure. It's all kind of a loose plasma that floats around and allows the bacteria to live. A eukaryotic cell then has internal structures that carry out the full metabolic process
Hmm.
without exporting some of that to the outside. Now, it does these eukaryotic cells would engulf other organisms,
Mm.
usually as a whole, and form a vacuole. And then that vacuole became a digestive particle within the cell. It could digest the food. So, or if it was a plant, if it was algae, it had a chloroplast. Instead of a mitochondria, it had a chloroplast, which was another type of cell that was engulfed as well. So this type of relationship, this symbiotic relationship, evolved into a permanent
Mm.
relationship so that today we have two types of DNA within our own cells, within our own bodies, and all eukaryotic cells have that. So the mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother's line because of the ovum is a complete cell and the sperm doesn't carry any organelles at all. So that mitochondria carries the mother's line, and it's different in different people. They can
Mm.
trace your maternal history. Geneticists can trace that through your mitochondrial DNA. There
Mm.
are mitochondrial inheritable traits and mitochondrial diseases. There are antibiotics that are destructive to mitochondria because they're targeting bacteria, and mitochondria are very much like bacteria. They're prokaryotic in their makeup. They have different protein machinery. They have basically a prokaryotic metabolism.
So we are
Okay,
coming from mitochondrial DNA.
yeah. So the mitochondrial DNA stays within the mitochondria, but when the cell divides,
Mm.
the mitochondria may or may not divide, but some of them go to each daughter cell, and so and they allow the cells to form specialized functions. For
Mm.
example, your liver cell or pancreas cell is going to be a lot different than the cells that form bone
Okay.
or nervous tissue. So your liver, pancreas cells, and any cells in your endocrine system are highly metabolically active. They require a lot of energy. They would have lots of mitochondria powering that cell, whereas your nerve cell, yeah, it does require energy, but it's not producing hormones. It's not producing um, um, actively producing antibodies, for example. So it doesn't require as many mitochondria. So that one feature allows cells to differentiate within, say, a human or an animal body to provide
Mm.
different functions.
Okay. So we
It
start
was a
with
huge
bacteria.
step.
Yeah, I agree. So we start with the bacteria, then we it convert into that creatures that goes into that waters. Now after that we had a huge leaps to that it's livable into up onto the land, right?
Yeah.
So I'm talking about the humans. So what were the some most significant movements in our own biological journey that led to us things like walking upright or the brains getting so big?
Okay.
Mhm.
There's a whole section where we talk about the moon, the tides, and how difficult it is for life to leave the oceans, come onto the land. And the first thing is there needs to be a compatible atmosphere.
Hmm.
So this new type of metabolism that happens in eukaryotic cells is called oxidative phosphorylation.
Mhm.
Okay, what that means is you're taking the energy and you're building a molecule that is an energy storage molecule called ATP.
Hmm.
It's a highly efficient energy process to store energy for the body. That requires oxygen as an electron receptor. So you have to have oxygen in the atmosphere. And there's a whole section of how that happened through cyanobacteria and other bacteria that produce oxygen. So now we have life on the land, and humans Well, okay. Start off with we have four legged animals. So we have lizards and then salamanders and we keep going and we get dogs and cats and we
Hmm.
get all these animals are four-legged.
Right.
And so how did we get up on our hind feet? How did we start walking?
Hmm.
And what was the advantage of that? So we have to look at this from an environmental standpoint. What mutations gave an advantage to the species? So walking on all fours, or like the primates do, they can walk on all fours. They knuckle walk on, and they can still use they can still stand up, but they can't walk well
Hmm.
on their hind legs. They can walk, but not efficiently. So there was a gradual change in mutations of our skeletal structure that gradually allowed more upright walking and running. So a bunch of things happened in sequence, sometimes at the same time. Mutations that gave us an advantage over other mammals, other primates in
Hmm.
particular. And one of them was our pelvic girdle. Um, if walking upright allowed you to reach the fruit on higher branches or gave you some advantage, you could use your hands to, for example, to pick fruit rather than your mouth. If you forage with your mouth, that's not as efficient as if you have a couple of hands. You can grab an apple. It'd be
Yeah.
hard to eat an apple in a tree with your mouth. That's why
Correct. Yeah.
with our
Hmm.
mouth,
Hmm.
with a horse or with a giraffe, yeah, they
Hmm.
have a long snout and they could probably do it. Well, anyway, so to uh, walk upright gave you an advantage because it freed your forelimbs.
Hmm.
And if your pelvic girdle there was a mutation and it had rotated somewhat, it would give you a bigger advantage to survive in the environment because you could maybe start to run on your hind legs. Um, so these mutations were reinforced. A lot of them were accidental. I would say they're all accidental. They had to give you an advantage in the environment. So let's look at our large brains. So a monkey or an ape or a dog, any other mammal, is born much more mature at birth than a human is. A horse can be born and is walking within minutes,
Correct.
or a
Yeah.
giraffe or an elephant. They're pretty advanced at birth.
Hmm.
The human is born, I would say, early by that standard. They're pretty helpless.
Hmm.
Not that these other animals aren't, but very helpless. They can only lay on their back or
Correct.
stomach. If you put them on their stomach, I
Yeah.
mean, they can't even roll over at first. So, uh, and the reason that is there was a mutation in a control gene or several control genes in our DNA that delayed bone development.
Hmm.
So babies are born with an incomplete skull. It's not, the sutures aren't fused. The skull is pliable
Hmm.
because these joints are not fused and the bones can move a little bit. So the only way a woman can give birth to a large-brained baby is that the skull is flexible and can compress and reshape a little bit during the birth process.
Correct. Yeah.
Then, as the baby grows, these bones expand and the head gets bigger. It allows more space for the brain. So that was one mutation, was in a control mechanism that delayed bone development.
Yeah.
There was an invention or I wouldn't say a discovery by early man that then allowed the brain to be large because our brains consume 20% of our energy.
Correct.
20% of the
Hmm.
food you eat is going to go to your brain. What
Wow.
percent of your body is your brain? It's
Hmm.
maybe 10%. I don't know. So, so a lot more energy goes to that brain because
Hmm.
it requires a lot just to be aware, just to just to function normally. It needs a lot of calories. So if you're most animals out there foraging for food, most mammals are in the natural environment. They're on the verge of starvation. They're a week away from starvation because there are two things. They have to forage for the food, then the food supply is scarce or spread out over a great distance, and the calories available in the food aren't very high, aren't all that available.
Hmm.
So if you look at a cheetah and the savannah, a cheetah when it tries to make a kill, it expends a ton of energy, lots of
Correct. Yeah.
energy,
Hmm.
and if it doesn't make a kill, it's depleted by that much energy and it hasn't added any calories.
Hmm.
So if that they have to be successful pretty frequently,
Hmm.
or they get too weak to be able to run fast enough to catch their prey.
Hmm.
So it's a real struggle for the cheetah to survive. They have to be in top shape all the time. Well, a human, once two things happened. Once they discovered fire and they could cook their meat, their game, their kill, like whatever it was, they could
Hmm.
cook it. It made it not only more sanitary, it released more calories. So if you eat a raw steak, you're going to get a lot fewer calories than if you cook it, break some of the proteins down so that they're more digestible or less digestion has to occur.
Hmm.
And that particularly goes with grains or plant foods because they have tough cells or membranes and maybe seeds and they're hard for our bodies to assess.
Hmm.
But if they're cooked, they're softened, they're partially I could say partially almost digested. So if you're cooking oats or if you're eating them raw. If you're cooking oats, you're gonna take them into your system much quicker than if you eat them raw,
Yeah.
and you're gonna gain more calories with less effort. So the fire and cooking allowed more calories and improved the food supply for early humans or
Hmm.
humanoids. The second thing was agriculture.
Hmm.
And once humans learned how they could plant certain plants, or they could take the seeds, or they could take parts of the plant, and they could make more of them, then they didn't have to travel nomadically after the game as much because they could raise their own food, and so that gave them more food security and better caloric intake, which allowed for the bigger brain to develop.
Yeah. I saw
And
one video that where our ancestor, let's call the mammals, they are just first they are start with the meat, right? After they go for the agricultures and every part. So I saw that even the before the 500 years or the 1,000 years, we checked that skull. The teeth were so strong, and the shape of the skull was so big at that time, right? And the teeth were so strong, they were not doing brush or anything. Still, even at today date, it was so strong and it's clean white. So after that, we went into that agricultures and everything. We just burns and eat and everything. After that, our skulls becomes lower down. Our teeth is become smaller and become a dirty and yellow. So I saw all that transitions.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for a plant-based diet on a number of levels,
Yeah.
environmental, health-wise, health of your teeth. So yeah, we have a lot of issues with our present diet,
Yeah.
um, and also environmentally. So there's another thing with uh, prior to fire,
Hmm.
or yeah, probably during the same time too. But humans were scavengers, or humanoids were scavengers. They could not yet hunt
Hmm.
effectively. And they didn't have the tools. They may have a sharpened stick or something, but they didn't really have before the Stone Age. And so the theory is, and there is evidence for this in the bones that have been shattered, is
Hmm.
that animals would make a kill on a large herbivore, and they would and in sequence, you had the large predators, the alpha predators would be the first to dine on the kill, and then gradually other animals come in, and vultures and smaller animals and so forth, until they pick the skeleton clean. And then once they did that, the skeleton was no longer a draw for predators, and these early humanoids could come onto the site, and
Right.
they would use rocks, and they would take the long bones, or the
Hmm.
marrow bones of the animals, and break them up, and they could twist and pull out the bone marrow and eat that. The bone marrow is high in fat, high in calorie,
Hmm.
and that helped. That was a substantial food supply, it's believed, for some of these early
Hmm.
humanoids. Um, there was another thing I was going to say about that. I can't think of it right now.
So you book that you mentioned about the microbiome. That
Yes.
so like for anyone who hasn't heard of it, that can you just talk about that? What is that microbiome, and how does it knowing about it change our perspective, and what does it mean for our human being?
Well, let's. It's a fairly recent um, knowledge. In other words, 30, 40 years ago, scientists didn't really think much about the gut bacteria.
Yeah. Okay.
It was there because it was there, but they didn't really consider much about it having any value to our bodies, to our metabolism.
Hmm.
The feeling is much different today. So we have 30 billion, 30 trillion
Hmm.
cells of our own DNA in our bodies. We have 33 trillion cells that
Hmm.
are not of our DNA. And mostly these are bacteria and viruses, most of them bacteria. Well, it's hard to say which is which, but so most of the genetic material that make up our body
Hmm.
is prokaryotic bacteria.
Okay.
And most of that, almost all of it, most of it is in the colon, in the gut, and those organisms they digest the remnants of our food, the food that we cannot digest
Hmm.
ourselves.
Hmm.
They digest, and some of the products of their digestion, because they're prokaryotic instead of eukaryotic.
Hmm.
That means the end product of their digestion is usually a organic molecule of some sort. They can't carry it all the way and get rid of the all the way to oxygen
Hmm.
like a eukaryotic cell can. So they leave a lot of products, and some of those are vital to our own survival. So if we have a healthy gut, we have a lot of diversity in the organisms in our gut, and paramount among those appears to be a bacteria called bifidobacterium.
Hmm.
And bifidobacterium is prevalent and common in fermented foods. So yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, even sourdough bread, although it probably doesn't have that much. It's
Yeah.
baked. But your live culture Greek yogurts and
Hmm.
stuff like that have a lot of bifidobacterium, and that seems to be an important component of our microbiome
Hmm.
as far as our own health is concerned. The American diet large or the diet a diet largely of refined foods
Hmm.
uh, leads to less diversity in the microbiome and
Hmm.
leads to a lot of health issues. They're finding things like allergies,
Hmm.
asthma,
Correct. Agree.
skin rashes, all of
Yeah.
these kinds of things because we're not getting the nutrients that a healthy microbiome provides.
Hmm.
So the microbiome also produces hormone-like substances that affect our mood,
Hmm.
that affect our psyche, that affect our other components of our metabolism. So it's almost a symbiotic relationship, but it's a part of our body. It's a part of our metabolism. And people who are have genetic problems with inability to produce an immune system, for example, would live in a bubble and in a sterile environment.
Hmm.
They are lacking. They don't have a healthy life. They're lacking a lot of things that they can't digest, and a lot of products of the microbiome.
Hmm.
So um, the, there is a there is a treatment they use sometimes in acute cases in hospitals
Hmm.
where a person has something called a colonization in their colon called Clostridium difficile, and it causes diarrhea, and it's and uh, and it's usually a result of antibiotic use, overuse, or they're being treated for something. And they found that they can treat this by taking a stool sample from a healthy individual
Yeah.
and implanting it in the patient, and that
Hmm.
adds that healthy flora, and it's been effective. And it's an odd treatment, but
Yeah.
it just shows that the importance of our microbiome.
I agree. I agree. So now we come to the part of your little really gets the people thinking space colonies. Okay, now let's talk about the future things. So for many, that's still pure the science fiction. Why do you believe that establishing a present space is not just a dream, but the potentially a crucial next step or even the necessity for the humanity?
There's a lot of reasons I believe that,
Mhm.
but I can hit a few. Number one, if we had a space settlement program, let's call it that, where
Mhm.
we're developing things, habitats in space for long-term living
Mhm.
that will supply all of the needs of humans. You start to look at what do humans need.
Mhm.
We need um, a lot of things physiologically, but psychologically, we need it. Don't you like to walk in a forest? Don't you like to watch a waterfall?
Mhm.
Go to the beach and watch the surf come in or watch the sunset.
Mhm.
And all of these things would not be available. You'd be in a mechanical environment. So the first thing I think you would need to do is create um, uh, environments, create ecologies in these space uh, habitats. And that's important for the psychology, but it's also important ecologically to provide the environment, to make the oxygen, to use up the CO2 that animal forms exhale. That CO2, if it builds up to a certain concentration, becomes toxic. So you need plants, lots of them, to consume the CO2 and make sugars and carbon compounds and so forth, and produce oxygen. So you need ecosystems. It would require a lot of study, a lot of concentrated science to develop these ecosystems.
Mhm.
That knowledge would be gained, could be used to help Earth. The social aspect of that is the more complex. In other words, if you have, say, you had 10,000 people living in this colony, in this environment that rotates, you would need to have one gravity. I missed that part. It would
Mhm.
need to rotate to produce one gravity.
Correct.
NASA's done a lot of studies on the space station and long-term uh, living at microgravity, and
Mm,
it has very deleterious effects in bone loss and other things, mental, physiological changes. A lot of stuff happens over
mm,
a period of even a year.
mm,
So to talk about generations and to talk about gestation,
mm,
and raising babies and children in space, you would need one gravity. That's a given. And as far as I'm concerned, that absolutely is needed. So you would have to have these rotating stations. The social implications, we cannot live in a society today on
mm,
Earth without having a shooting, without having a murder, without having some aberrant behavior that in a space colony, in a space environment, would likely destroy uh, your system. So you couldn't allow that kind of discord or those kinds of people. So you would have to have a mechanism to screen those people out. And I believe projecting out into the future, we will be able to test people to see if they have some mental deficiencies. They're already
yeah,
doing a lot of studies on the brain
mm,
and physical links in the brain that are diminished can cause big problems. So you would have to screen these people out. You would have to find ways to treat people who are suffering from mental problems, and because it would be you couldn't tolerate that kind of behavior in that space environment. Your economy would be entirely different. It wouldn't be the corporate type economy with profits to shareholders and that kind of thing. The manufacturing and production and all the benefits that the society would provide, or the government would provide the society in space,
mm,
would have to be for the benefit of the people at large and not a select few. So, for example, it would be impossible to have a mega mansion or
mm.
or a yacht. Where are you going to put a yacht? You're not going to have those things in space. So
Yeah, agree, agree.
you're gonna aspire to your social recognition is not going to be on what you have, but
Mm,
what you know and what you do, I think. So there's a change in society that would be required, and I
yeah.
think it would be required so it would be developed. That too could possibly be translated back to Earth and to help solve some of our problems here. And the studies on environment would also be translated back to Earth to help solve some of our problems. Food production would be a major issue in space. You couldn't supply space habitats with food from Earth. It's just not economically possible to feed
Mm,
large numbers of people, launching in rockets. It's too expensive and environmentally damaging here. So you'd have to uh, produce your own food in space. That technology is rapidly developing with hydroponics and with your maybe cloning meat. So you're
mhm.
not using animals. You're growing
Yeah.
you're growing your hamburger in the lab, and just growing your food with bacterial cultures
Mm,
where you tweak the organisms to produce certain proteins, and then you combine those to make an energy shake, for
yeah.
example. So and vertical gardening, and there's all kinds of things that could be applied in space. That technology is rapidly advancing. That applied to this planet would allow a lot of the farmland to be reconverted to natural habitat, which would help our environment, would also slow down the extinction rate
Mm,
of animals. So I think in those ways, it would help our survival on this planet. Ultimately, we're going to have to leave this planet
yeah.
anyway. if we survived that long.
Yeah,
So living in space would give us we would be training for that
yeah,
day, that event when we leave.
yeah. Even your book doesn't suggest about the space colonies, but what about that O'Neill cylinders, the designs that we talk, that is also mentioned in your book, O'Neill cylinders. That's uh, O'Neill cylinders, right? That's about
Yeah,
that's about
yeah,
it's a space where the humans can live, say like same as in the on Earth we are living, right? We can able to produce the foods there. That could be the oxygens, that could be the gravity also. Can you
yeah.
brief about that designs?
Well, let me see. What was the doctor's name in the 70s?
Niels 9 1865 around.
Uh, yeah, that doesn't come to mind right now. But anyway, these
Yeah.
cylinders were first proposed in yeah, 60s,
Hmm.
70s, and they were a lot different than what scientists are thinking about today.
Hmm.
But they've looked at different concepts. They've looked at the rotating wheel, like in 2001, A Space Colony, they had a double rotating wheel that produced the one gravity on the inside surface of this
Hmm.
wheel. Um, you can't hold a big volume in that for
Hmm.
atmosphere and stuff like that. So the bigger volume of atmosphere you have in your environment, the more stable it is, the less likely you're going to have a catastrophic event. So these cylinders would be maybe um, two 2 kilometers in diameter and
Hmm.
maybe 15, 20 kilometers in length.
Yeah.
And they would have rocket engines attached to the outside that could start the rotation and change the rotation if it ever became necessary. For example, if you're doing repairs at the outside of this rotating cylinder, you got to hang on
Yeah.
with, because it's rotating. So maybe you would slow the rotation if you have some major repairs out there so that you don't fling everybody off into space.
Yeah.
Um, so you would control the rotation in that way. And they would be built from materials initially from the moon and then from the asteroid belt.
Hmm.
And there's a story. The asteroid belt is actually a very good source
Hmm.
because there were at least 2 planets originally that were molten as planets form. And so the heavy metals um, sunk to the center and the lighter materials to the outside. Well, these planets or planetoids collided eventually and fragmented. So the asteroid belt has three basic rings. There's an inner ring that's basically rocky. It's called the S ring. It's silicon-based rock and material. There's a middle ring called the M ring, which is mainly metal or a high concentration of metals.
Hmm.
So those fragments would be from the innermost part of these planets that broke up. And there's the outer ring, which is called the C ring or carbonaceous. So those are high carbon content asteroid particles, and you could think of them as big lumps of coal, maybe.
Hmm.
Um, so they would be a source of carbon. You'd have a source of metal. You have a source of rock for basic building, um, and structural material from the metallic asteroids. So now that we've gotten into this territory, we're into my next book, which is a science fiction book,
Yeah.
and that is on how you would build and live in these colonies and the different resources and what's happening on Earth in 250 years. So I project Earth is in a recovery mode from a disastrous result of climate change, and is trying to dig its way out of it. Which there's been a lot of political upheaval, and you can look at the world today and look at immigration,
Mhm.
immigrants coming largely from tropical and subtropical areas, trying to get into more temperate zones. And it's
Mm.
not all environmental. A lot of it is political,
Mm.
but these areas will become more and more unstabilized as climate change progresses, as global warming and weather disasters increase. You're going to have more and more migrant pressure from these areas on the planet
Mm.
toward to the more temperate and the colder regions. So we're seeing that today. So I've extrapolated 250 years in the future, and we have tremendous social problems and upheavals, and we have people who the haves and the have-nots.
Mm.
The separation, in my view, in this book is more than what we're seeing today. But I was just reading in the paper today about where people are vacationing
Mm. Yeah.
and how that demographic is changing.
Mm.
So more people are, they're not going to the islands and the Caribbean as much or the South Pacific.
Yeah.
They're going to Iceland and Norway, and they're going to, these more northern Canada,
Mm.
Alaska. They're going more north or south, but most of the planet's landmass is in the northern hemisphere. So we're seeing a preference to
Yeah.
vacationing in a cooler area. So in California, where I live, we've had a unusually cool summer.
Mm.
It's mostly in the 70s and low 80s. It hasn't really gotten into the 90s very much,
Mm.
or like last summer, it broke 100 a few times.
Yeah.
But Arizona, the Midwest, a lot of places back east or north, even up in Oregon and Washington, they've had some, in Idaho, they've had some very hot weather. So
Yeah.
it's just shifting weather patterns. And so we feel like we've had a really nice summer so far.
Yeah.
Uh, but these changes will continue to cause havoc.
Okay. Now, suppose if we build success space colony, okay, what kind of society are you imagining?
For a successful colony,
Yeah,
what kind of
space
food? What?
colony. Suppose if we
Yeah.
build successful space colonies, that how what kind of a society that you can imagine?
Well, yeah. First of all, I designed the colonies in clusters. So I call them space islands,
Okay.
and a cluster is an archipelago. So it would be like a cluster of islands. And they would be located, the initial ones would be located at Lagrange points in orbit
Mm.
between the sun, between the Earth and the moon. And these are balance points that require very little energy to maintain the orbit. They orbit the Earth, but they're uh, in relation to the moon's
Mm.
orbit. So they would be in clusters of, my vision was six, but it could be any number that would fit in
Mm.
this area of balance, and they would be different environments. So you would have, say, six different islands, and they would each have a unique environment. You could have one that would mimic tropical islands, that environment, palm trees and so forth. You could have one that had a ski resort.
Yeah.
You could have one with lakes and maybe fishing.
Mm.
Uh, but in all of them, there would have to be a large a component that was dedicated to plant life to generate and maintain the atmosphere. So the population people would be small by comparison, and any animals would be competing with people for the available resources. So you might have a zoo in
Mm.
one cylinder that would be a savanna, say African savanna, and would have those large animals.
Mm.
You might have another jungle natural environment with those organisms, and they would be sequestered from people, except you would visit like on vacation maybe,
Hmm.
and but they wouldn't have the impact of logging. They wouldn't have the impact of mining.
Yeah.
You're mining asteroids, you're mining the moon, you're mining Mars, but you're those are all dead bodies. Those are all um, there's no there's no environment to disrupt.
Yeah.
So that all comes from the outside, and then it's processed in what I call there's a MEC facility, which is a manufacturing, assembly, and construction. So it's run by robots mainly,
Yeah.
and it processes all this material you're getting from the moon and from the asteroid belt and from Mars. These Mac facilities would make your steel beams, would make your toasters. You know, anything you needed would be made on site by materials that came from our solar system and collected. So it's all described in the second book,
Yeah.
Outbound Islands in the Void. So that's the only way it could work. Is you would have to use the resources that are there, and in the story, they actually develop more things than can be used in space, and they export those uh, uh, produced items to Earth.
Right.
So they're using a glider, a one-way glider that they make, re-entry glider to bring them down, bring products down to the planet, which reduces the requirement for people on Earth to engage in mining, which is highly polluting.
Hmm.
Um, you you can produce a lot of energy in space as well. You have unlimited sunlight.
Okay.
There's no weather. There's no
So,
clouds.
so you have mentioned all this in this on your second book?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
We
okay.
talk about that a lot. Well, of course, there's a lot of story going on,
Yeah. Yeah,
throughout.
we'll have the next episode for that one.
So I'll show you the cover. It's
Yeah.
yeah. So that's the glider that that brings the materials down. It's a one-way trip. So because we have Earth has a dense atmosphere,
Hmm.
you can bring products to the planet with no energy use. The space shuttle had no on reentry had no power. It did have rockets to put it in position, and then once it started reentry, it was a total glide the whole way, all the way to the
Oh, okay.
landing.
Hmm.
So they would be largely unmanned
Hmm.
and just contain all kinds of goods from space, a gift from the stars.
Yeah, that would be really interesting to read this same book. So your book is really a masterclass of the big history. You're connecting the physics, you're connecting chemistries, biologies, and even the sociology, right?
Right.
So what was the most challenging or the ultimately rewarding part of this book that you take immense task and trying to connect all these dots?
That was yeah. So that was the hardest part because it's such a diversity of information.
Hmm.
I had to bring it stepwise, like this happened, and then because of that, this other thing happened, and so on throughout the whole story, and then the importance of each step. So I tried to pick areas in this whole process that were most significant,
Hmm.
and one of them was the transition from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells.
Okay.
A big one was the change in metabolism from anaerobic fermentation to um, to oxidative
Yeah.
phosphorylation. My tongue is a little tied up this morning. Um, yeah, those were big steps. There was something called the Great Oxygenation Event. And
Hmm.
when that happened, most of life on this planet was anaerobic, which meant oxygen was toxic to the
Hmm.
organisms. So there was a big die-off of a lot of life forms when this big oxygenation event happened.
Mm.
And the cause of that was cyanobacteria. It produces oxygen in its metabolism through photosynthesis. So uh, NASA has considered using cyanobacteria on Mars, on a Mars settlement, to produce oxygen because it's highly efficient. The organism itself is toxic
Mm.
to other living things, so you don't want cyanobacteria in your swimming pool. But at this great oxygenation event, the cyanobacteria were growing as sheets of colonies on the ocean surfaces. And some of them may have been miles in diameter, just huge sheets. And they produce oxygen, and the world was in a reduced state, which meant iron would be black. In a reduced state, iron is black. When it rusts, it turns red. And that's caused by oxygen. So the whole world had to rust basically
Yeah.
before the oxygen would start to build up in the atmosphere. And although that event killed a lot of organisms, it gave great opportunity to a more efficient metabolic system. It gave them a huge window to take over evolution to become the dominant type organism. So these sheets of cyanobacteria were produce oxygen on the surface, and underneath there were what we would call transitional organisms or facultative anaerobes, and they would live in a partially oxygenated environment so that they could tolerate oxygen, but they still fermented. Fermentation is very important to us, to our food supply, um, because it's incomplete digestion,
Mm.
and it allows all these nutrients to be available to us. And so it's a good thing it wasn't totally wiped out,
Yeah.
that we still have that. We can make beer, and wine. So, and those are, to an extent, are good things, I guess.
Okay. So generally, mostly all these dots that you have connected. So what are the sources that you get, and from where did you get all this information?
Yeah. Well, yeah, mostly it's kind of a lifetime of learning.
Hmm.
So, um, with my background in microbiology and molecular biology,
Hmm.
so if you look at the universe of the physical world,
Hmm.
physics is at the foundation.
Correct. Yeah. Correct.
Quantum mechanics is at the foundation of that body of knowledge.
Hmm.
If you look at the living world, um, molecular biology is at the foundation. And if you have knowledge in that arena, molecular biology is continuous across all living things and
Hmm.
very, very similar. So we can look using our knowledge of molecular biology, we can look back and we can see how closely we are related to some other organism by how different, say, an albumin protein is
Hmm.
in our body or in some earlier form.
Hmm.
How many mutations are between us and that other organism? We can look at any kind of a protein. There are analogous proteins that metabolize all the way down the life chain,
Hmm.
the evolutionary chain, and they tell the story about how we're all related. So that background helped me conceptually organize this story, this book. Um, but I've been out of college for a long time. I spent my career in the laboratory, um, clinical laboratory,
Okay.
and as a laboratory director mostly. And so I did part of my job, expand and maintain my knowledge that way.
Mm.
And then when I retired, um, I'd always wanted to write this book, but I never had the I always wanted to do other things in the moment. I
Mm.
wanted to travel. I wanted to, do other things. And I never got around to it until COVID hit. So then I started just going online and researching and buying books and just reading everything I could. And when I thought I knew something, because my knowledge was dated back,
Mm.
a number of years, I felt like I had to update it. But I had the seed of the knowledge, and to update it was relatively easy. So I thought, well, this is what I think I know. So then I look into it, and a lot of that search was online. You have to be a little bit careful with online and validity, but because of several things, because I know that I have the science background, I can tell when something's not right. I
Right.
don't,
Yeah.
you
Mm.
know, and I use Wikipedia a lot. Now,
Mm.
Wikipedia works, people who join Wikipedia and contribute to Wikipedia, they have an expertise in a certain area. They may write an article or two, and then they're charged with maintaining the validity of that article. So as knowledge changes, they can go back in and change that. If someone comes in and corrupts the article, they are charged with maintaining that. So it's been tested.
Mm.
Um, Early on, it was tested for validity, and
Mm.
they found it to be pretty reliable source. So that could flesh out some, add more current information. Also, they give a lot of references in the Wikipedia articles,
Yeah.
so you can go back to the libraries, you can go back to the original source and check the information. So I did that a lot with this book. The difficult thing was picking what topics to talk about.
Mm.
So, for example, I'd come across a story and I go, "Hey, that really speaks to something."
Mm.
And one of them is the Tennessee walking horse. Do you remember anything about that?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to draw the point that the way we walk and the way we swing our arms is
Mm.
directly related to how a fish swims. It undulates its body, it uses its pectoral fins and its tail
Mm.
in opposition to swim, and all walking, aside from the insects, all
Mm.
walking and flying land animals came from fish, original fish that climbed up.
Yeah.
So that part, there's a little wiring in our brain, a little part there that carried that forward. And this Tennessee walking horse, partly by training and partly by mutation and breeding, uh, doesn't walk that way. It's which is a more efficient way of walking.
Yeah.
So just because we do something a certain way doesn't mean it's the most, or we've grown a certain way, doesn't mean it's the best solution to the problem. It's what was available to
Mm.
evolution to address whatever the environmental issue was. So it's not by design. So the Tennessee walking horse was used and developed to use it on farms because it was very efficient. It used less energy to walk
Mm.
and therefore could pull, and this is a large horse, it could pull a bigger plow and it could work longer hours. So um, that was a story I thought that demonstrated two things. One, that showed the continuity of the evolution of
Mm-hmm.
the human brain, and the second was that evolution doesn't always have the best solution, it's the best available solution.
Okay. Okay. Yes, so sir, it has been really fascinating conversation with you. I really
Yeah, I
enjoyed
think
a
we
lot. Your book is truly the evolution of life. I would suggest all the college students and all the school students also that must read this book. These books really blow your mind and you will learn a lot about our ancestors and about the futures about our own life. Thank you, sir, for being a guest on the Shami Show. It was pleasure to meet you.
Oh, it was a great show. I'm sorry it went over time, but
Yeah, no worries. I really enjoyed a lot.
thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.